I think when you say the word tax, it sometimes makes people space out. It makes people think boring. In fact, what we're talking about is government intervention in our lives in the most visceral and present form. So with that, I have asked all of our, you can object to what I say as well. I'm going to start this with, immediately to my left, with Jason Furman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's going to speak for a couple minutes. I've asked them all 4 questions to consider. I think we all can accept, and they can disagree with this contention, the current tax system for both corporations in America and Americans, individuals, is an absolute and utter mess, regardless of where you come from in any sort of political thing. The second question, well, the first question then is, what should you want? Second one is, how should you think about what we should want? The third thing is, what is feasible? And the fourth is, what is moral? And so each of these are going to speak for, my panelists are going to speak for about 7 minutes or something like that. And then we'll go into questions, but hopefully we will have interrupted them before we get to that point. So Jason, if we could begin with you.
Thanks so much for having me on this panel. I was doing the first panel of the day. Yesterday I got a call. They told me that it was my friends Kevin, Doug, and Maya, so I said yes. If they had told me the subtitle of the panel, I might have had second thoughts. Let me give one-word answers to your 4 questions and then elaborate on them. What should we want? Reform. How should we think about it? Neutrality. What's feasible? Business tax reform, all one word. What's moral? Individual tax reform, all one word. So to unpack each of those, what should we want? We should want reform. We should want to reform the entire tax code. We should want to make it more efficient, more fair, simpler. We could go on at great length about any of those. How to think about it? I think one of the most important concepts in thinking about the tax system is a tax system that's more neutral. And a more neutral tax system means that instead of people, and especially businesses, making decisions for tax reasons, they'd be making decisions for economic reasons. Now, there's important exceptions to that. For example, research has an externality, so having a subsidy for research as a way to internalize that externality would be an efficient way to conduct policy. But as a general principle, the more the tax system isn't why you're making your choices and you're making it for innovation for business, the better off we're going to be. In terms of what's feasible, there is a reasonable amount of convergence of opinion around business tax reform. The president proposed a rate of 28% overall, 25% for manufacturing. Republicans in Congress have proposed a rate of 25%. Similar ways to broaden the base, a similar concept of a hybrid international system, not a pure territorial or a pure worldwide, and using the transition revenue associated with business tax reform to finance investments in our infrastructure. All of those are areas of common ground. There's a lot of differences in the detail. There's a lot of thorny issues to work through, but I think that's politically feasible, and I think it's economically feasible as well, as long as you take care of small businesses and small pass-throughs. You don't just make it about big business, it's about all business. The last question was what's moral? I certainly think having the most prosperous country we can have is moral, and I believe in that, and I believe the business tax reform combined with infrastructure I just outlined would move us in that direction. But I also think we have a substantial challenge with income inequality, an income inequality that translates into something that I think is an even more fundamental value of lack of equality of opportunity. I think the tax system, both by closing loopholes related to tax benefits for high-income households and a loophole associated with carried interest at death, using that money to not just cut taxes for the middle class and those working to get into the middle class, but to really expand opportunity with tax incentives for childcare that creates a more neutral system between choosing between work and non-work so that the deck isn't stacked against you on that choice through the tax system. for college, internalize some of the benefits associated with that, and help people in general get into the workforce. So that's ultimately what we'd like to do. We're going to keep pushing on it. I think some of those ideas on the individual side have Republican antecedents as well, but ultimately we should be doing all of this.
Neutral is such a neutral word. Kevin, can you unpack what Jason just said and what he's really saying underneath the rubric of neutral, and whether that's really
so what Jason's
moral?
Really saying is that we're starting out with the U.S. as the high-taxed country in the developed world, and he wants to keep it that way. I mean, that's what neutral means. So I'm going to start with how to think about it, and then all the other answers I think will flow from that. I think that the problem with the U.S. tax system, and I agree with Jason 100% and have taken a lot of flack from some Republican friends on the Hill, that we need to go after the corporate tax all by itself. We don't need to combine it with other things and have an income tax reform right now, because that's too much to change. But the way to think about it is that in the U.S., if you make money here in the U.S., then you immediately pay a 35% rate plus maybe some state tax. But if you make money in Ireland or some other low-tax country, then you only pay tax in the U.S. when you mail the money home. And so if you are a company, like a company that has a lot of intellectual property, that can move the money to Ireland, then you can avoid U.S. tax altogether as long as you don't mail the money home. The way I think about that is that there are some firms that can do that and some firms that can't. So if you're a big U.S. manufacturer, maybe you're making Boeing with airplanes or Caterpillar with those big trucks where the tires are bigger than this room. They're not necessarily going to be able to move stuff to Ireland. But if you're Microsoft or Google, then it's easy for you to do that. The problem, I think, then you say, well, who really suffers because of the system? Well, the people who suffer are the people that would have jobs in the U.S. if those firms located their activity in the U.S. The people who benefit are the people who get the jobs abroad because we locate the activity abroad. And there's a massive amount of evidence that started with a 2006 paper that I think I remember was written up at The Economist that Aparna Mathur and I wrote, that showed that corporate taxes really are very, very good variation in corporate taxes at predicting cross-national patterns in wages. It's really the workers that bear the corporate tax. There's even a 2013 paper by some German folks that found that even holds within Germany. And so the question is, how do we get the corporate tax down? And we're not doing it because we think that corporations are necessarily paying too much tax, because everybody who can is avoiding it. The reason we want to get the corporate tax down is that we want to help workers in the US and watch their wages go up. And so the question is, can we reduce the corporate tax? I wouldn't even necessarily have a reform. I would just reduce the rate, and I think you could have very beneficial effects. And I think that the problem is that neither party really wants to do it. So if they're out there talking about neutrality and revenue neutral reform and so on, then they're basically revealing that they just fundamentally don't get the economics of this. And the problem, though, is that from the point of view of a corporation, you might argue that the US system is the best of all worlds, because you've got the highest tax in the developed world, so nobody's hounding you to increase your taxes, and yet you don't pay it. So what's better than that, right? And the point of view, and so then you could say, well, actually, so therefore the Democratic Party and the unions they're the ones who should be pushing the reduction in the statutory rate. And my view about them is that they somehow are so, vested in the view, or at least there's such a politically important part of the party that's vested in the view of the world that's supported by Elizabeth Warren and Thomas Piketty, that capital and labor are at war with each other, that the notion that we might help workers by making this place more attractive to capital is anathema to a large chunk of the Democratic Party. And so it's obvious that the US should cut its corporate rate. I mean, even the OECD is telling us to do it, and we're not doing it, in part because people are saying, oh, well, we need to have a revenue neutral reform as cover for not really wanting to change a thing. And I think that that last thing is definitely not Jason. I know that he would actually like to reform the corporate tax, but I'm not so sure that group doesn't have a lot of US companies in it. Because if in the end you go after, say the average multinational is paying something like 15% now on their worldwide income. If we go down to a 25% rate, but they really have to pay it, then they're a lot worse off. And so I would say that most of the money doesn't really want to open up the corporate tax code, and that's why we're stuck where we are.
So feasibility then?
That's what I'm saying.
It's not feasible.
Well, it's feasible if you make me dictator, which is a really good idea, by the way. Yeah, but let me dictate this for a day. I'll only mess with corporate code. I'll set it to 0.
So we're really lucky that we have a person who sat in Jason's chair a decade ago and continues to consider these issues, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. And he's now the president of AAF, and which is a consultancy think tank.
It's a think tank, right? It's an over 21 daycare center. That's what those things are.
Over 21 daycare centers.
So what are your thoughts on this? These four questions.
I mean,
and please, I think that we've set a bar here with neutrality as an interesting non-word.
Right. I mean, if I should have picked a word, by the way, I was trying to say non-distortionary. You did criticize neutrality, which I didn't say but thought. When I should have thought you'd like.
I encourage this sort of reintroduction.
The food fight thing's good.
Everybody feels so much better than Jason. Look at their faces.
So what should we want? We should want a tax code that is built on some basic values, that means something, instead of a hodgepodge of revenue-raising items. And how should we think about it? Well, we should think about it from the metrics that Jason brought in, which is economists like tax codes to introduce the fewest possible distortions. And I think we should think about those distortions in light of the pressing needs of our time. So right now, the pressing need for the United States is to grow more rapidly. If you look at the budget Jason's group just put out, the president's budget, the long-term growth rate of the United States is estimated at 2.3% per year. Pretty dismal. Mm-hmm. The CBO, my old shop, estimates the long-term growth potential at 2.1% per year. And just to make the point in the most clear fashion, that means that these are the good times, because we're growing faster than that now. So it's going to get worse, not better. And so if you've got an economic policy question to answer, and tax reform is one of those, it should be dedicated to fixing your biggest problem, and that is our biggest problem. So for me, that says you should not distort the decisions that influence growth, and those are the decisions to save and invest. And that means we should have a tax system that's based on taxing what you take out of the economy, not what you put in, tax on consumption if at all possible. And that should be the goal. We should be taxing consumption as comprehensively as possible. And I also think that's the moral thing to do, because it is what we take out of our economy, our work, our effort, our capital we supply to the economy. I don't think we should be taxed on the supply of those things. We should be taxed on what we take out. And then we'd get some other things right. We can have some fairness issues that always come up about having higher tax rates for people who take more out, and I think that'd be fine. We'd more correctly distinguish between rich people who don't take a lot out of the economy, like Sam Walton, who put it all back in, and rich people who take a lot out, like Paris Hilton, and we tax them a lot. And I think we'd have a much clearer-headed discussion about tax policy if we did that. None of that is feasible. None of what I just said is a snowball's chance in hell.
This was the academic part of the discussion.
I just wanted to stipulate that we're going to have a really dysfunctional discussion about tax reform because we aren't willing to go to back to basics and ask the question, how much revenue do we want to raise, and what are the basic principles by which we want to raise it? I think the American people would embrace that discussion, quite frankly. But to Kevin's point, that's not where the discussion is going right now. I will point out my preferred way to do this really just basically turns the entire world into a traditional IRA, where if you save or invest, you deduct it from tax, and when it comes out, you tax fully. It solves a lot of the problems that consume Washington, which is when it comes out, if it comes out as a dividend, interest, or capital gain, it gets taxed at the same rate, so you don't get any of those sort of problems of turning one kind of return into another and all the inefficiencies that come with that. It also, I think, is the best for the distribution, because the other way to do this is a Roth IRA where you tax it initially and then put the money away. That allows all windfall gains, monopoly power, and anything else that comes in there to escape tax. And if you do the deduction up front, that doesn't happen. So there are ways to do this that have precedence in the tax code. There are, I think, good reasons to go that way, but for lots of reasons, it's not on the table right now. And I think that's very sad.
So in this world that we live in, what
So
what's feasible? And then we'll go on to Maya.
But what's feasible is to as much as possible, with your eye on the ball, and this is why I disagree with Kevin, I think you do have to put the individual tax in play and think about both the individual and the corporate tax. You should drive to that system as much as possible, right? We have an individual collection mechanism, a business collection system. You can design them so that they mimic that kind of a tax. It just wouldn't look like it on the surface, and that's where we should be doing.
Maya. Maya McGinnis, the Committee for well, let me just say, before I say what her current title is, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, I was intrigued to learn she was an ex-bank analyst on Wall Street and somehow migrated to her new position. So I think that probably brings an interesting perspective into this conversation as well. What are your thoughts on those 4 questions and on what the prior speakers have said?
Okay, thanks. Well, so first, what is it that we want to do? The basic point of taxes is to pay the bills, right? We want to raise revenues, and you want to do that in the most efficient way possible with some additional goals, often distributional, alongside that. On the distributional front, I would just, as an aside, say, I think we try to do too much of our making the tax code fair, whatever you think that fair is, or making government fair through the tax code. And we should spend more time thinking about how we actually change some of the distributional issues on the spending side of the government and have tax focus a bit more on raising revenues efficiently. I would agree that sort of the first objective is reform, because the tax code, both corporate and individual, are in such terrible shape. There are a ton of ways to improve them. And I just think the basic point that what we do through the tax code now is spend. Tax expenditures are $1.3 trillion a year in lost revenues, because you can't really get spending policies done anymore in government. And so the way that you do it is you create some kind of targeted tax break. And as a result, this is why our tax base makes no sense, particularly on the individual side, but on both sides. So going after the basic framework of reform of broadening the tax base and lowering rates is something I think makes an awful lot of sense on both sides. And that's particularly relevant to the immediate tax debate. But I actually think if you take a step back, there are a lot bigger issues that we're going to continue to have to grapple with on the tax front. And I think the biggest one is, does the corporate tax work anymore? So in a world of sort of global, of incredibly mobile capital, trying to tax at the corporate level seems to me like it really is going to be this ongoing struggle that we're never going to quite get ahead of. And that instead of just thinking about business tax reform, we should be in a bigger space thinking about what is it that we're going to tax and not tax and where the mobility is. And I also think that's relevant in terms of distribution. I think with growing income inequality, there's going to be more and more talk about how to make the tax code more progressive. You even saw the leader of the Senate Finance Committee, Hatch, today. I think I just saw a headline saying he kind of acknowledges that the tax code is going to have to be more progressive as part of reform. But I think we're going to continue to find that wherever you try to make the tax code more progressive, you're going to have a problem of whatever you're taxing leaving. And that's been on the business side. You've seen that with inversions. You've seen that with corporate taxes. You're going to start seeing that more and more with individuals leaving the country. And I just think they're bigger issues that we should be thinking about. I think in terms, one other issue on, this is sort of broader than just the tax code and tax reform itself, but one of the big issues as we grapple with tax reform over the next couple of years, and I think it is going to be, this is going to be a year that starts a discussion that keeps going for a while, is how in return for reforming the tax code in a way that would make us more competitive, that is one of the clear goals, we're going to ensure, to Kevin's point, that that does show up as higher wages. Because I think a lot of people aren't comfortable with that relationship. They're not confident that if you make the business tax code more efficient and do tax reform there, that that's going to translate into higher wages. And I think people, to buy into that, are going to need to have more kind of guarantees or assurances that that relationship holds true. And to Jason's point on neutrality, what I understood, and I'm not sure if I was right or wrong, whether you were talking about revenue neutrality, I understood you talking about kind of the base broadening pursuit of neutrality, which is right now we have an incredibly inefficient allocation of capital because of the things that we subsidize through the tax code on both sides. And so that if we broaden the tax base, there's actually a huge potential benefit in that of having a better allocation of capital. So if that's, I mean, I actually think we need to do neutral tax reform so that we don't lose too much revenues. But if it's neutrality for the allocation of capital, incredibly important goal. In terms of what's doable, I'm with Doug. I think we should be doing comprehensive tax reform, and I think it is doable. And no offense, Jason, but I think the White House kind of put out this marker that we couldn't do both individual and business tax reform, and I think that's what we should be shooting for. It makes a lot more sense to look at this as comprehensively as possible. And there are a ton of parts of the tax base on the individual side that we should be reforming. Just start with the healthcare exclusion, the home mortgage interest deduction. You have a lot of inefficient subsidies through the individual side. So I would stick with going after that if it were at all possible. Whether that's doable or not, or just business side is doable, I think what is doable is that we start a really important discussion that moves forward this year. I believe that the White House wants to do business tax reform. I believe that the leaders in the Senate and the House very much want to do, and it seems like you're hearing both business tax reform and comprehensive tax reform, but they would happily kind of go along with steps forward for either. I think the devil is in the details when it comes to base broadening. It's really, really hard, given how little success we've had recently in getting much of anything done in Washington. I wouldn't bet that we're going to get tax reform done, but I think we can take steps forward. And if you look at what the president's done and what Camp put out in House Ways and Means before, and a lot of the tax ideas that have come out there, there's a ton of overlap. There's a really good starting point that we can get to work on. And so if people kind of go into this committed to moving tax reform forward, I think that can happen. And just finally, on your question of what is moral, for me, it comes down to the fiscal framework. I think what's really still, I don't like to toss around the moral too much, the word moral, but problematic is the fact that we are on an unsustainable debt path in this country. I think entitlement reform is a huge, huge piece of that, and a functioning tax code is the other half of that. And we need to have a way that we're reforming the tax code as we're thinking about the fiscal future, and that to me is kind of the moral component of it.
So I want to have questions from the audience, and I want to give Jason in particular a bunch of time, but I wanted to ask, I have a couple questions, but I wanted to ask Kevin something before we go further. One of the premises on taxation and government policy is that the world and America are both becoming increasingly unequal, that income inequality is just growing, and you know, the Economist named 2 books of the year in economics and finance. One was, I'll probably mispronounce, well, one was Jim Grant's on laissez-faire approaches, but the other was Piketty's. Maybe I pronounced his name wrong. And I just want to ask Kevin 2 questions. Was that book accurate? And do you agree with his, I mean, are these people pursuing from a correct assumption of inequality, or is their entire framework diluted and mistaken, and therefore anything they come up with really wrong?
Well, I have a paper coming out in the May American Economic Review, co-authored with Alan Auerbach, that I think documents pretty decisively that just about every corner of Thomas Piketty's book is incorrect. And the data are wrong, the theory is wrong, and so you know, Piketty is a different conversation, but I encourage you to go to the NBER website where the longer version of the paper was just posted. It's
so is paper. Inequality?
But what about inequality is that I absolutely think that pre-tax, pre-transfer income inequality is skyrocketing. Piketty ignores the massive increase in transfer payments so that, you know, consumption inequality doesn't look like it's skyrocketing nearly as much. But if we want higher income for low-wage people, then there are 2 ways to do it sustainably. One is to give them more capital to work with. The other is to train them better. And we've got basically, frankly, a Democratic Party right now in control. I guess you asked me to throw some bombs. That, you know, is basically cares more about the teachers' unions than our kids, and so we're not, you know, there's not much hope of getting them to do much with school reform. And they are hostile to capital. And so the idea that, you know, if we give more capital to workers, their wages will go up somehow seems like it's, you know, contrary to their entire doctrine.
So I don't want to be in any way, you know, this isn't targeting the administration or you, Jason, but I really want to give your...
sounded somewhat like it, but maybe I misheard.
I wanted to give you the opportunity...
might be overly sensitive.
I wanted to give you the opportunity to hear what a lot of people in America are saying, and therefore have the opportunity to actually refute those things. So take it in the most positive light. This is, I mean, I think a lot of people in the audience probably think, you know, they've heard facets of Mr. Hassett's comments before, and they really would appreciate however, you know, you can re-enlighten them into...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd actually like to focus on some of the things I've heard that I agree with.
Piketty's book is wrong.
He did get the age of Rastignac from Per Gorio wrong. but hopefully he'll correct it in the paperback. But I haven't published that in the AR. I very much agree with the points I think everyone here has made that we need more economic growth and we need more productivity growth. And central to more growth is having more capital and having more skilled workers. Productivity growth in the decades leading up to 1973 was 2.8% a year. In the decades since 1973, it's been 1.8% per year. And a big part of the income slowdown that is lamented, appropriately so, I think these days increasingly across the political spectrum, is because of that. The president is the first president in decades to call for cutting the corporate tax rate. He called for cutting it from 35% to 28%. The previous president did a couple $1 trillion of tax cuts, not a penny of it cutting taxes on the business side. So I guess I disagree with the assertion that this president's anti-capital. This president very much would like to increase capital investment and the quality of it, and that's why he's called for that.
Didn't taxes on capital go up under this president?
I think, too, I was just talking about the taxation of business. To the other part of incomes, though, if you look at the slowdown in incomes since 1973, is a dramatic increase in inequality. And let's forget the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1%, and let's talk about the bottom 90%. The bottom 90% got 68% of the income in 1973. By 2013, that was down to about 50%. So you go from 2/3 to half. That happens at the same time that growth in the economy is slowing. So we need to reverse that too. The good news is there's a lot of instruments that can work on both of those simultaneously. So if you can have a tax reform that deals with one of the problems we have in terms of incomes, which is labor force participation by secondary earners, and this builds on ideas from Kevin's colleagues at AEI and from others, that helps the tax system be more conducive to second earners working, a tax system that's more conducive to going to college, a tax system that's more conducive to those Americans that don't have retirement savings, getting a retirement savings account. This is an idea that came from the Heritage Foundation, working together with Brookings. All of these are ways that we can actually address inequality and growth, which have been the two drivers of the biggest problem we face, which is that large slowdown in the growth of middle-class incomes.
Let me turn to the audience. This is a fantastic panel. There's a question. Look, everyone who has a question, raise your hand so I can see where you are. And we're going to start working. We have a lot of questions. We only have 10 minutes and 48 seconds or something. So don't make a statement. Ask a question and do so concisely. So let's start with the woman right here.
Each of the panelists, if you could, by fiat, just get one component of tax reform, corporate or individual, changed, what would it be?
Let's start with Maya.
I'm going on the individual side. I'd get rid of the healthcare exclusion, which I think is one of the contributors to growing healthcare costs. But that's my second choice. I would do business tax reform right now.
Second, Mr.
International tax reform for business, the U.S. business, most important.
I would, if you look at why the U.S. is now the high tax place, it's because everybody else reduced their tax rate about 3 times since we increased it under Bill Clinton. And the reason they did that is that when they cut the rate, then they actually didn't lose much revenue and they saw some growth, and so then they did it again. And so for me, if I could change one thing, I would just cut the corporate rate in the U.S. from, say, 35 to 30. Change nothing else, we'd get more revenue, more businesses would locate here, and then we'd probably do it again.
Mr. Furman.
If I could do only one thing, I would do a 8-part progressive middle class, progressive tax reform combined with a pro-growth business reform combined with infrastructure.
Okay.
I think I left some, oh, and teachers.
Next question. Keep your hands up. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that would be fine. And then if you can move your way backwards, yeah.
If you could change, Catherine Marsh, if you could change one thing in the political system to help you get to the one tax reform thing, what would it be?
Maya, why don't we start again? Could you move the mic back to the next person? Maya?
Wow.
You can pass, because we don't have much time if you
No, I'm going for money in politics and the lobbying that goes for all these tax breaks.
Okay, the next person.
I'd have the courts draw congressional districts and get rid of the gerrymandering.
I would make it so that scorers are allowed to think about, analyzing international evidence on what happens to countries that reduce their corporate rate, because usually their revenue goes up, but they're not allowed to say that.
Every time they've done that, they've come up with numbers that aren't that different from the scores they currently do. So I'll second Maya's suggestion.
Really, silly dynamic scores if it's the corporate tax, right?
Okay. There's a, right, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jesse Sandoval.
If you could move the mic as soon as he's finished the question. So, yeah.
Is our tax system becoming more dependent on high net worth individuals? And if so, what risks does this pose to our tax system?
Maya?
Yeah, I mean, because I thought of 12 more answers to the first question, but another thing that I would do is I would shift a lot of the tax burden from the business side to the individual side, but I bump into what I was talking about in the beginning, which is my fear that as we do that more and more, the high net worth individuals are going to start to leave. I mean, it's tiny numbers of people who do right now, but it's growing, percentage-wise, it's growing really significantly, so I think that's going to be a real risk.
Absolutely. This is not your grandfather's income tax. This is a surtax on high-income individuals. That's all it is. That's who pays it. And we've already seen the consequences. If you look at what happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, we got a big bump up in the dot-com bubble in bonus and options income, flowed into the US Treasury. It's how we balanced the budget. And then when that went away, we ended up with a big revenue shortfall early in 2001, 2002. And it'll happen again.
Kevin?
I think that high-income folks are definitely financing a lot of government and a lot more of government, and they presumably, on average, aren't really happy at how high their taxes are. I would guess that labor and capital both will be increasingly mobile in the future, and it'll be harder and harder to sustain the revenue that we get from high-income people.
Jason?
I think the economic system worked perfectly well with the types of rates we had in the 1990s. They led to a balanced budget. The thing that got that budget permanently out of balance was the tax cuts that we did in 2001 and 2003.
That's just not true. Ignore that.
Actually, Doug, if you look at the CBO...
It's not true.
Doug, if you look at the...
I wrote the CBO thing.
I know, I understand.
I can walk you...
Doug?
I can walk you through every table.
You know what? I want to give a
If you
minute
look at
to this.
CBO, if you look at the CBO estimate of the deficit in 2008, it was exactly what was projected in 2001, the only difference being taxes, war, and entitlements. Policy changes
war,
on all three
entitlements,
of those.
all
policy
spending,
changes,
which are all
policy
spending.
changes, no, and taxes. Policy
but
changes on all of
the
those.
taxes are not the largest portion of that. That's just wrong.
Let me just take a half step back, because I think these disagreements are very, very important. Can you give me 20 seconds, I know that's not much, 30 seconds, on why you think that is wrong? And can you reply in that in 30 seconds? I think these fundamental issues of what Clinton did and what Bush did are still among us. And if you were just to enlighten the audience about that, they would walk away from this panel with something very, very valuable. So take 30 seconds.
So if you look at the swing from surplus to deficit and you just add up legislative changes on the spending side, the tax side, and then you look at economic impacts, the dominant thing is the economy. The second most important thing is changes to the spending side. That includes wars, a prescription drug program, and a lot of things that we can disagree about, but the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts are not the biggest piece.
And I'm going to refer you to a paper that I co-wrote with someone named Alan Auerbach, in this case in Tax Notes.
Do I have
Kevin's
to write with Alan to have any
co-author too.
credibility? Is that how it works?
And there was a $5.6 trillion projected surplus in 2001. The surplus disappeared. That surplus disappeared at the same time as a recession. That's misled some people into thinking the recession is what made it disappear. But what Alan and I did was we looked at the year 2008, so after that recession, and said, what did CBO get wrong? They had projected, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but it's off the top of my head, they'd projected a $500 billion surplus. Instead, there was a $500 billion deficit. It was a $1 trillion mistake. What did they get wrong? Turns out their economics were almost exactly right. The technical assumptions they made were almost exactly right. The entire, like 95, 98% of that prediction error, once you got past the recession, was the policy changes that had happened between 2001 and 2008. Those policy changes were both quite substantial on the revenue side and quite substantial on the spending side, and it was the combination of higher spending and lower taxes that, no surprise, led to a much larger deficit.
Can I say just 20 seconds on that?
Yeah.
Which is that didn't the corporate revenue to GDP drop over that time period pretty sharply, even though there were no real changes? Yep. And so it seems like.
Of course, because you had you had more people shifting to the individual side.
Oh, so you're saying it just went to pass-through entities, and you guys accounted for that in the paper? Okay. I'll look into it. I'll read the paper.
You know, one of the most important things that I think we're going through as a country right now is the fight about the future hinges considerably on our perceptions of the past. And there are very, very strong distinctions in what people feel about what happened in the recent past. And therefore, these sort of discussions, which just seem like little squabbles, I think are enormously important. And if we have more time, I think we would pursue them, because I think it's valuable to understand what really did go on. Let's take 2 more questions or so if we can. So, yeah, you have a mic.
Yes, Eric Noel from Canada. In 1987, most of Canadians were against a federal sales tax. All the provinces in Canada said that it cannot work. Business leaders said, well, maybe we're not sure, it's going to be tough. Finally, we have for 27 years, like most OECD countries.
You're going to have to cut the question.
A federal sales tax. So when will we have a debate in the US about a federal sales tax?
Does anyone want to address that? And please move the mic.
That's my tax. It's not politically feasible, so the way to do it is to disguise it as essentially a 2-part tax that looks like a flat tax with more rates. That's it.
Sounded almost like John Gruber there.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? Okay. I'm terrified that there are a lot of people who want to speak. Now, after you get this person, can you come up to the front and work your way to the back? So please, there's someone with a mic there.
Josh Barrow with the New York Times. How much does this really matter? If you got your desired tax policy, how many tenths of a point would that add to the long-run trend real growth rate?
Okay, very technical question. Who would like to address that? And if you could move the mic up front.
In a growth model, it would be 0, right, in the long run. The question is, what would it do over a 5 to 10-year period? And again, in the taxes and wages literature, the elasticities are pretty high. Even in like Germany, they had regional variation. I could send you a link to the paper in corporate taxes, and it, a 10% change in the corporate tax rate in the fullness of time, if it went up, reduced the wage by about 7%. And so those are real effects on real people's welfare.
Anyone? Yeah.
My answer would be the most important thing is not getting the tax reform, it's keeping it. And to keep it, you have to fix the spending side. The reason 86 unwound, in part, is because we had what we thought were big deficits. At least at the time they seemed like there were. We opened up the tax code to get more revenue. If you open it up, the reform unwinds in a heartbeat. So,
all right, now I have to pause. Did you want to comment on that, Jason?
I think we should be doing everything we can that has a plus sign, and I think it has a plus sign. I think some of the classic quantity of investment types of models that Kevin is one of the leading experts on is a part of the story, but I think the quality of capital too. So you're not misallocating your capital, you're doing it to where it has the highest returns, you're investing in innovation, you're not investing in avoiding taxes, and I think that has the potential to possibly even have a growth effect above and beyond a level effect. I don't know that for sure. It's a hard thing to study, but I think that's a possibility.
Another question, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a Piketty question. Kevin, you dismissed him, as many people have, with, read my paper, the guy's an alarmist.
You've got to cut the question short. Because
the ratio of high net worth to the rest of the economy is the highest since it's been in the Belle Epoque. This shouldn't matter. So give us 20 seconds. I think there was 20 seconds on a refutation. Give us a 20-second refutation of the Piketty thesis.
Basically, the first part is that income inequality is very decisively getting, radically worse. But wealth inequality, it's much more of an open question. And if you look at the source data that he cites, it doesn't agree with the charts in his book. And there's a fundamental flaw, the kind of thing that you might really have trouble with if a term paper came in like that. The second thing is that he talks about comparing the return on capital to the growth rate, saying that if the people with wealth get R times W, and R is bigger than G, then the amount of income the wealthy get is going to end up eating up all of the economy. And there are a lot of reasons why that analysis is incorrect. But the very first one is that when you have $100 in the bank and you get $10 in interest, which you'll never do ever again, but you used to, right? Then you only get to keep $5. And so he excludes taxes from the analysis. If you put taxes in, then R times 1 minus tau is less than G, basically, throughout his sample period. And that explains why the wealth inequality isn't getting out of whack the way that he documents, but it's not consistent with his source data. Another site, just to say, because I know this is maybe going to be available to a lot of outside viewers too, is that Wojciech Kopczyk has a piece that just came out looking at the wealth inequality question. He's a co-author of Piketty's co-author and so on, and a really, really serious economist. And I would commend you to that too if you want to think more about wealth inequality versus income inequality.
So I was going to say, who would like to stand on a chair and ask a question? They're desperate, but we are over, and it is a scarce resource time. So I'm really sorry that I didn't get to all of you. I'm really grateful to our panel. I think they were terrific, and I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. So thank you very, very much.